everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am going over 8 more mistakes that newbie writers make. Y'all seem to really like my original 7 mistakes that I see newbie writers make video, and honestly, there's more. Some more things that I see a lot of newer and novice writers making in their writing, and especially their attempts at novels, that if you're a bit more aware of them, you can definitely improve your writing and take it to the next level. So the first mistake that I see a lot of newbie writers make is what I call Thesaurus madness or Thesaurus disease. It's when writers, they seem afraid of using basic English language, like words that are straightforward and that people use all the time to describe things. Instead, they go to the thesaurus and they look up synonyms and antonyms of those words, and they're like, ooh, there's the big fancy word. That's got a bunch of syllables. Do I know how to pronounce it? Doesn't matter. It's gonna make me sound really, really smart. And ultimately, it doesn't. Typically when you use, big, what I call $3 words or $2 words, when you can use a 1-cent word, you actually come across as either pretentious or like you don't know what you're talking about. Very often when I see writers use these $2 words, they don't mean what they think they mean, because synonyms aren't always that straightforward. Yeah, you can find it on thesaurus.com, but it doesn't mean that it has exactly the same meaning, especially in the context of the sentence. So you both don't want to come across as pretentious and have your writing sound purple and overloaded. You want to have clear, concise prose that the majority of readers are going to understand. You don't want to send them to Google looking up a word. But also, you want to avoid misusing words and essentially sounding dumb. You don't sound smart when you use fancy words. You often sound like you're trying too hard. The second mistake that I see a lot of newbie writers make, and I honestly can't believe I didn't include it in my first video because this is one of the big ones that I talk to a lot of people about. I am guilty of it. I actually do this in a lot of my first drafts, and it's, I'm not a newbie writer, but it is a common mistake, period, with writers, which I call character soup. It's when you have way too many characters and they all have names and they all have elaborate backstories. They don't all necessarily really do anything concrete or important in the story, but darn if you haven't introduced 9, 10, 12, 15, 20 characters in your story. And this is not Game of Thrones. We are not all George R.R. Martin, and generally you just don't need that many characters. So this actually is one of the reasons, if you've noticed, why most characters, especially in something like YA fiction, tend to only have 2 friends max. And sometimes it bothers me because I'm like, most of us have more than 1 or 2 friends, but the reason you see this is if you have more than that, unless your story is about, say, a group of friends and you need 4, like Pretty Little Liars territory, although I guess they had 5 in the beginning. But the point is, otherwise, it's way too much. Keeping track of who they are, being able to tell them apart, but just giving all of the characters that you have in the story enough to do. A character who doesn't contribute to the primary plot arc, the conflict, or character growth are essentially dead weight in your story. My advice for when you have character soup is to combine characters. Very often you will find that you have supporting characters in different places in your novel, and they essentially perform the same function just in different places. So think to yourself and challenge yourself of, okay, so can I take character X, Y, and Z and put them into one character, just character X, and maybe get a little bit creative with how this one character would be in all of these places, but essentially performing the same function. Often you're going to end up with tighter characterization and a more dynamic book. The third mistake that I see all the time, and I've actually touched on in a couple of other videos, I've kind of like tap danced around it, is when dialogue and scenes fill a lot of pages, but they don't actually move the plot forward. I see this a lot with info dumping, and also sometimes this comes up with white room syndrome, or if you've made poor POV choices or even character soup choices. It's when you have scenes and we as the reader can tell, oh, I can tell that the writer really liked writing this scene, or they wrote this scene to kind of explain something to themselves or to get a feel for the story, or this whole scene only exists for playful banter, whatever the case may be, but the scene doesn't actually progress any character relationships, growth, or the overall plot. You should always look at scenes in your books and think, how does this contribute to the overall plot? Or your A plot, B plot, your conflict, character growth, all of those things. Every scene should do something. Every bit of dialogue should do something, whether it's character development or moving the plot forward. There is one way to kind of look at this that Susan Dennard uses. She includes it in her revision method, which I'll link down below to her for writer section of her website, which is excellent. Now, me, the person who's allergic to outlining and kind of doesn't like pinning myself down too hard, I don't do this because the thought of doing this makes me want to cry, but this might work for you, and it is creating a scene card for every single scene in your novel, and you basically put where the characters are, who's in the scene, where they start and where they end, essentially nailing down the function of every scene in your book. And you can start to see that if you can't answer the question of, where do they start, where do they end up, and what is the point, that scene might be dead weight. The fourth mistake that I see a lot of newbie writers making is tense shifting, and it drives me freaking barmy. This is a kind of finer details grammar thing. This happens a lot, I find, in first person present tense, not always, or also just in cases where a writer has changed their book from one tense to another. Tense shifting drives me crazy, and this is when, say in the first person present tense, that you have the character ruminating on something and you don't use the conditional tense correctly. It's essentially not using the one consistent tense throughout the whole book. You want to look for any case where if your story is in present tense, you don't want to slip into past tense in other places, but always be aware that sometimes there is conditional past. Grammar is actually really complicated, and so what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to link you down below to some grammar resources. Look in your own writing for this. If you are writing in one tense, look for any place where you slip in and out of the tense. For me as a reader, it is a red flag that a writer is very new to this and that they don't have the detail orientation or just the grammar foundation to get it right. This is why it is so important to have a good foundation in grammar if you are going to be writing. This doesn't mean you had to ace it in school, but it does mean you might want to read some grammar resources. Again, I'm going to link to some down below, or just ingest a lot of well-written fiction. You'll get a sense for how tense and grammar rules work if you read enough. The fifth thing that I see a lot and is kind of related to tense shifting, or I should say that I tend to see this same mistake in works that also have tense shifting, and that is head hopping. This relates to the point of view of your book. Typically, your book is going to be told from a single point of view, and I will also link down below to my Choosing the Right POV for Your Story video because I go over all of this there. If your story is from one point of view, if you are doing a close point of view, then you should only be showing the reader and doing things from the perspective of that character. Head hopping is when you are in a scene and it is from one POV, and randomly in the middle of the scene or chapter, you throw in a paragraph from someone else's point of view, or the second half of the chapter randomly takes place from another point of view. That is head hopping. You are hopping from the head of your POV character into the head of another character randomly, and it really throws the reader, because typically when we're reading, we orient ourselves into the point of view of the character from whose perspective you are telling the story. So this doesn't mean that you can't, of course, have multi points of view. There are multi-POV books, but you'll find that typically they don't shift back and forth in any single scene or section. If you want to switch POVs to another character in a multi-POV story, especially if you are doing third person, you would want to do that with section breaks or chapter breaks. The sixth mistake that I see all the time in newbie writers is overly formal language and refusing to use contractions. There's this idea that you are a fancier writer if you don't use contractions. And I think this comes from kind of an old school idea, because honestly that is what used to be taught in school. So like our parents' generation was taught, contractions are bad, don't use contractions, they're too informal. But pick up a piece of fiction. We all use contractions in everyday speech. We use contractions in journalism. By the way, you can start a sentence with and or but. I am on the and or but starting a sentence train, and I give you permission to do it. It is completely okay. And it is completely fine to say doesn't and can't instead of does not and cannot. Now, not using contractions, especially in dialogue, can be a character choice. It is a way to present a character who is more formal. You also might pull back from contractions if you are writing a historical piece, but generally if you are writing any modern fiction and you want to have your readers not be annoyed and tripping over words, please, for the love of God, use contractions. The seventh mistake that I see all the time in newer writers is being afraid to share their work with other people. I see this on Reddit a lot, where people post and they say, I'm afraid to share my work with beta readers or critique partners because they might steal from me. That's a big one that I see all the time, and I'll tell you 98% of the time that's just not going to happen. We all hear that, old wives' tale, that horror story of the person whose idea was stolen by a beta reader or critique partner, but it happens so rarely. You shouldn't be afraid to share your work, because sharing your work with others and getting feedback from peers, essentially critique partners, is invaluable to the writing process. None of us can really write and be creative in a vacuum. You're always going to have to get feedback from other people, hear that constructive criticism, take it on board, and then use that to improve your work. You're gonna get constructive criticism from an agent, you're gonna get it from an editor, you're gonna have to learn to work with an editor and an agent, and honestly the best way to do that is critique partners. Share your work. Don't be afraid of criticism, but you can look for critique partners who aren't going to, tear you a new one. You can ask for a compliment sandwich, for constructive criticism, or even sometimes cheerleading can be very helpful to the writing process. But I'd say the part of it that is a mistake that I see in newbie writers is not sharing their work so that they do end up writing in a vacuum and thus never improving. I do think that you need the constructive criticism of a solid CP relationship to improve as a writer, period. I just don't think you are going to improve if you don't do that. So many of these newbie mistakes that I'm going over, I used to do a lot of them, both in this video and my previous video. I did a lot of them, and many of them I started recognizing and breaking myself of the habit because I had beta readers. This is when I was doing fan fiction, and of course I've had some very instructive CPs as well, but I had some beta readers who changed everything for me. They were really good at grammar and the craft and mechanics of writing, and they're the ones who pointed out to me, like, you're head hopping, you're tense shifting, that's not how you format dialogue tags. I have a whole video about dialogue tags, which is another newbie mistake that I see a lot of writers make, but I'm not officially counting it in this video. I'm gonna link below to that video. So sharing your work with others and being open to hearing feedback and actually taking it on board and using it to make your writing better is essential to leveling up as a writer. And last but certainly not least, the eighth thing that I see a lot of newbie writers do, and this kind of ties into the you have to be able to share your work and get feedback from other people. And that is, a lot of newbie writers are afraid to kill their darlings. You can't be too precious with your writing if you want to improve and get better and revise your novels effectively to make better books. We are, of course, all quite attached to our writing, when we're not beating ourselves up for being horrible, because imposter syndrome is real. We tend to like our writing. It's precious to us. Like it comes from our hearts and we pour it onto the page, and we love the stories and the characters that we have. And very often we do get very sentimentally attached to scenes that we either had a lot of fun writing, or we had a really clever idea, or we think we're really funny in that scene, or a character has a moment in that scene that we really, really like. But you have to learn to let go, even of the things that you love. I'll tell you that with any given novel, you're always gonna have things that are relatively easy to cut because you're not super duper attached to them and you're like, okay, fine. Every book, there's going to be that thing that you love. You really love it. And it could be a sentence or a character or a chapter or a scene or what have you. And you have to cut it. It is an obstacle in the way of your book working. And you might resist it first. I actually give you permission to resist it first because we all resist it first. But you'll find that when you eventually come around and you learn to kill those things that are precious to you, most precious to you, that it unlocks the whole book, that it makes everything better, and you miss it, but it was the right thing to do. So I encourage you as writers to start on the journey of learning to kill your darlings. You can start off slow, cut a sentence, save everything. I literally save everything. So some of those darlings, you know, they're sitting off somewhere else, and every once in a while I find a way to use some of the darlings that I had to cut in other places, whether it's a character that I had to kill, you know, remove from the story, or if it's a turn of phrase that just was not working on the page or happened to be in the middle of a scene that later was dead weight and I had to cut the scene. Save these things, you can use them later. But also sometimes you're gonna look back on them and go, I loved that thing, but it was okay to let it go. So kill your darlings. You're gonna be okay. Kill your darlings, share your work, cut characters, do all of the things. So those are 8 more mistakes that I see a lot of newbie writers making. I really hope this was helpful. Just like the last one, maybe you had an aha moment of, I think I do that, and hopefully I provided some ideas and tools for fixing those things. Let me know down in the comments if you have any questions or mistakes that you have identified in your own writing or that you've seen in other people's writing, though let's, always be careful not to, throw too much shade on people. Let's not be too mean in the comments is what I mean to say. But let's talk a bit about newbie writer mistakes and how we can fix them. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you are notified every time I post a video. As always, everyone, happy writing.